Sorry about that. Freedom of speech can certainly be unfortunate at times. However, I did want to discuss it in the context of the UK because this is one of the most quintessential examples, so frequently cited by free speech advocates in their ongoing vigil for the decline and inevitable collapse of Western civilization. According to this narrative, the UK has been sacrificing the most basic civil rights of its citizens upon the altar of political correctness, betraying the proud tradition of English liberty, as exemplified by such Enlightenment figures as Locke and Berkeley. Wait, was Berkeley Irish? How about Hume? Is Hume British? Scottish? I don't remember because I'm too intellectually lazy to do the required research for a truly well-informed video, instead relying upon speaking too quickly and using unnecessarily complex discourse when expounding the most simplistic, banal, or shallow of points in order to make myself sound more intelligent than I really am, as unsuccessful as that approach has always proven to be. However, on the topic of not remembering things, if you can cast your mind back to the late 2000s, early 2010s, perhaps you can recall that there were already people being prosecuted for saying the wrong things in the UK. It's just that these were hate preachers in mosques because of the dangers of Islamic terrorism. So it's hardly a case of the totalitarian left suppressing the right of good, upstanding English citizens and capitulating to the encroaching, insidious enemy within, that is Islam. These free speech absolutists who say things like freedom of speech has fundamentally become a right-wing issue because so-called liberals have abandoned any liberal principle deserving the name, those kind of people are not going to complain about the suppression of freedom of thought for Muslims. Because they're not free speech absolutists, because you can't be a free speech absolutist, because there is no single principle so profound that you can construct an entire political philosophy around it and apply it consistently in all situations without compromise or contradiction. These kind of people are more interested in virtue signaling, ironically enough, about how there are more extreme people on their end of the political spectrum further to the right than themselves, who they disagree with, but whose right to freedom of expression they will defend, perhaps even to the death. They might say to me, when I talk about complexity or ambiguity, that nuance is a great place to hide, that it's obfuscation, hiding from the truth because I lack principles, but they're the ones who are hiding, obfuscating, and denying the ambiguity and complexity of the situation. The UK is an interesting and illustrative example because, well, I'm currently speaking English, and this debate is taking place throughout the Anglosphere. We all have this historical connection to the British Empire, not just because of the language, but because of its civil institutions, which have influenced the systems of government wherever we live. The UK, with its ancient system of arcane, often absurd laws, and the concentration of power in a centralised state authority, is the example which the classically liberal utopia of the United States was explicitly constructed in opposition to and rejection of. The UK is a much more powerful state than that of the United States. It doesn't have the same protections of basic freedoms that the US has. There's no constitutional right to bear arms, so the citizens are defenceless against their tyrannical government. And there aren't the same protections for freedom of speech. There are stronger hate speech laws and libel laws which are absent in the US, although President Trump wants to bring something like that in because he's not a big fan of anybody talking shit about him ever in any situation at all times. One interesting example of the power and perhaps overreach of the state in the UK is the UK National Science Curriculum, which has substantive scientific content mandated for all schools. You have to teach evolution, for instance, and many Muslim schools run afoul of this. But if you don't like teaching that, you have to get out of the education business in the UK, because the UK is unapologetic and proud of the fact that every child in their country is guaranteed the right to a legitimate scientific education. But you're not going to hear the religious right in the US or the UK complaining about the way that this is affecting Muslims, because once again, they're not absolutists, they just care about their own side. Another interesting example is how people say freedom of speech is a pressure release valve, that when you suppress people's right to express themselves, that's when they resort to violence. So, if we see an opening up of the discourse, we should see a decline in violence. However, looking at the Trump presidency, since his inception, Trump's inauguration, there has been much more open discourse about white nationalism, anti-immigrant sentiment, and far-right politics. This has not, however, led to a decrease in violence. In fact, in 2018, all of the terror attacks were domestic right-wing terror attacks. There were no Muslim terror attacks in the US, and there has been an increase in violence, especially hate crimes against non-white people who look like immigrants, especially people of Latino descent. So, this narrative, this mechanism, plausible as it sounds, doesn't seem to be working. And it makes sense if you think about the Muslim world. If you imagine an Islamic country where people are openly chanting things like death to Israel, where there's an environment of hatred and these sentiments are being stirred up and encouraged by the leadership, where there's open discourse of this kind, is there any possible world where we imagine that this would lead to a decrease in the prevalence of violence or the risk of terrorism, compared to a state where these forms of expression are more tightly restricted or discouraged by the official power structure? Of course, this makes no sense whatsoever. These are the countries where that kind of discourse is taking place, where we see the most terrorism coming from them. So there's this symmetry between the Islamic world and right-wingers in the secular West. Not that I consider Muslims to be left-wing, of course. It's not like they're diametrically opposed. Conservative Muslims are by definition conservative. It's just that protection of minority, ethnic and religious minorities, are now a principle of the left. One other interesting example is about how Sam Harris talks about Islamists. He's identified these concentric circles. You know, at the core you've got jihadis, terrorists, and then around them there's Islamists. So Islamists aren't terrorists. They might denounce terrorism, but they think that Islam should play a fundamental role in the political governance of Muslim countries, that they should be Islamic states, where the system of law is informed by the Islamic tradition of jurisprudence, Sharia law. In much the same way, Sam Harris is not a white nationalist. He denounces white nationalism, he does not shoot up mosques, and has dissociated himself from the people who do that kind of thing. However, he does think that opposition to Islam should play an official role in Western governance, that we should acknowledge that we are at war not with terror, but with Islam. He has complained about Muslim immigrants, and he has suggested that there should be official policies, such as anti-profiling, where if you're an old, white, grandmotherly-looking woman, you won't get randomly stopped in the line at the airport. Of course, all this would do is create another selection pressure, where Albanian or Serbian Muslims, or white-looking converts, would be targeted by jihadis to be radicalized and recruited to get around these measures. One final example is how Twitter have said they are not going to apply their algorithm in catching, detecting, or shutting down right-wing white nationalist discourse, because any algorithm which can successfully do so would also catch certain tweets from mainstream Republicans showing that white nationalism has become much more mainstream, whereas ISIS and Islamic activists who are promoting terrorism using Twitter as a way to network and plan attacks and to discuss and promote hatred are routinely shut down. So this narrative about how right-wing speech is being shut down and discriminated against online is clearly nonsense, as you can see by the proliferation of right-wing and white nationalist YouTubers on that platform. So, to sum up, we have, in the UK, hate preachers and Muslims being disproportionately affected by hate speech laws. We have the UK National Science Curriculum also largely affecting Muslim schools. We have Twitter not applying their algorithm to white nationalists, but routinely shutting down people like ISIS. And we have people like Sam Harris, who are like a Western equivalent of Islam. These are all examples of the symmetry that I see. And lastly, there's the idea of freedom of speech, how it should suppress or decrease the probability of violence, and how this doesn't work. And you can see, obviously, why it doesn't work when you look at the symmetry and consider the Islamic world. So those are just a few points that I wanted to bring up about this supposed decline of freedom of speech and the way that liberals have been said to betray Western society and its traditions.